She was just 10, limping behind her father, eyes filled with hope, unaware he was leading her to die. Born with a twisted spine and a crooked leg, she had already survived the world's cruelty. But nothing could prepare her for the betrayal that came from the man who gave her life. He dragged her to the riverbank, whispered a lie about angels, and then tried to drown her. But just when death wrapped its cold fingers around her, something unimaginable happened. A horse, her only friend, appeared from the shadows and did something so shocking, so fierce that it silenced a powerful man and exposed a truth that shook the entire town. What that horse did next will stay with you forever. In the cold stillness of early dawn, the wealthy landowner Charles Whitmore stood at the edge of his private estate, the river quietly winding through his sprawling property like a serpent. Dressed in a tailored coat and polished boots, he looked every bit the successful man people saw from afar. But behind his sharp features and perfect image, his heart harbored something darker: shame, anger, and a twisted sense of pride that no one dared to question. Behind him, struggling to keep up, limped his 10-year-old daughter, Elsie. Born with a deformity that left one leg shorter than the other and a spine curved just enough to keep her from running, dancing, or standing straight, Elsie had known only rejection from her father. Her eyes, however, burned with innocence and hope, two things Charles saw as weakness. "Keep walking," Charles ordered without turning back. Elsie's thin hands clutched her little shawl as she hobbled through the morning frost. Her breath came in puffs, the cold air slicing her lungs, but she said nothing. She never did. She had learned early that her words meant little to the man who gave her his name, but not his love. Her mother had died giving birth to her, and in Charles's mind, that was reason enough to resent the girl. "Accursed child," he would mutter when drunk. Took her life before she could even hold her. Servants whispered about his cruelty, but no one dared defy him. That morning, Charles had lied, told the maids he was taking Elsie out for some fresh air, maybe to teach her about the woods. But the truth was far more sinister. He had grown tired of the pitying looks from his elite friends, tired of hiding the girl away during social events, tired of pretending he cared. He wanted her gone, not in anger, not in a sudden rage, but in cold, calculated detachment. A silent end in the water, no mess, no questions. Just a child who wandered too far. That was the story he would tell. As they reached the riverbank, Charles finally stopped. He turned to Elsie with a strange softness, kneeling to her level. "Do you remember what I told you about angels?" he asked, his voice almost kind. Elsie, startled by the change, nodded slowly. "You said Mama became an angel when she died." Charles smiled faintly. "That's right. And wouldn't you like to see her?" Her lips trembled, unsure what he meant. She didn't get time to ask. In a single motion, Charles grabbed her, lifting her frail body like a rag doll. She screamed, loud, desperate, but the sound vanished into the empty woods. He stepped into the shallow water, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the cold numbness that had overtaken him. "I'm sorry, Elsie," he whispered. "You weren't meant for this world." As he pushed her under, the water swallowed her cries. Her hands thrashed, weak but fighting. For a moment, Charles hesitated. Her eyes, those same eyes her mother had, looked straight into his. But then, he forced her deeper. And then the silence broke. A thunderous neigh pierced the morning. Charles turned sharply. Galloping toward him with fury in its eyes was Ember, Elsie's horse. A gift from her mother's family. Ember had grown up with the girl, understood her better than any human. The stable boy often joked they shared a soul. Ember had followed the two from a distance, sensing something was wrong, and now it charged with purpose. Before Charles could react, Ember crashed into him, sending him sprawling into the mud. Elsie's body floated back up, limp, eyes closed. But Ember was already in the river, nudging her with its head, frantic and wild. Charles scrambled to his feet, drenched and stunned. The horse bared its teeth, pawed the ground like a beast ready to attack again. He backed away slowly, heart thudding, not from guilt but fear. The animal wasn't just angry. It was protective, defiant, and it had seen everything. Ember pulled Elsie gently to shore, nudging her chest, licking her face. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then a cough. A sputter. Elsie's tiny lungs expelled river water as she gasped back to life. Ember neighed again, this time with joy, circling her protectively. The girl coughed, shivering, her fingers clutching the wet grass, eyes wide with confusion and terror. Charles stood frozen. What had he done? What had he nearly destroyed? But there was no time to think. From the distance, stable hands came running. Ember's wild gallop had stirred commotion. One of the grooms saw the scene and rushed to the girl. "What happened?" he cried. Charles didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth opened, but no words came. He watched as the man wrapped Elsie in his coat, as more people gathered, as eyes locked onto him, judging, questioning, realizing. Ember stood between Charles and the girl like a wall, refusing to move. For the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore felt something he had never known before: powerlessness. The beast he thought was just an animal had exposed his soul, laid bare his sin. Word spread like wildfire. The servants whispered. The staff no longer bowed. And the townsfolk, once eager to please the wealthy landowner, now looked at him with disgust. But none of that mattered to Elsie. She lay by the fire hours later, wrapped in blankets, Ember curled beside her like a guardian spirit. Her tiny hand rested on the horse's muzzle, and in her eyes was something new: clarity. She had seen death, stared into the cold eyes of betrayal, and been pulled back by the one creature that truly loved her. She didn't speak for days, but when she finally did, her first words were, "Ember saved me. Papa tried to send me to Mama." And in that moment, everyone in the room broke. The room fell into stunned silence as Elsie's fragile voice echoed off the wooden walls. "Ember saved me. Papa tried to send me to Mama." The words, simple and trembling, struck harder than any scream. One of the maids dropped the cup in her hand, shattering porcelain on the floor. The stable hand who had carried Elsie and took a cautious step back, eyes wide with disbelief. But Ember didn't move. The horse remained at Elsie's side, unmoving like a loyal soldier guarding a queen. Charles stood in the doorway, soaked clothes clinging to him like guilt that refused to let go. For a second, his mouth opened, perhaps to explain, perhaps to deny, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say? The eyes in the room slowly turned toward him, one by one, no longer full of respect, but revulsion. He wasn't just a man who nearly killed his daughter. He was a coward. A rich, heartless coward who had tried to erase what didn't fit into his perfect world. Elsie's words spread like wildfire beyond the walls of the estate. By sunset, the town had heard every detail. The mayor, who once dined with Charles and laughed at his jokes, sent a quiet letter requesting he not show his face at the next community gathering. The sheriff came by, not to arrest him. No one had physical proof, but to let him know that eyes were watching. Even a rich man's shadow can't cover up a sin that big, the sheriff muttered before walking away. Charles felt the weight of something unfamiliar, consequence. But inside the house, something far more powerful was taking place. Elsie, though physically weak, began to heal. Her words came slower now, each one deliberate, filled with meaning. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. It was as if the river had taken the last of her tears and left behind only resolve. Every day, Ember stood by her side, refusing food, refusing sleep, as if the horse knew the girl's soul needed guarding for more than just the cold. Charles watched this unfold like a ghost outside his own life. He would stand in the hallway, peering into her room but never entering. The courage he once used to command rooms, close deals, and build empires had vanished. All he had left was silence and the crushing realization of what he'd done. He had nearly killed the only person in the world who could have saved him from the emptiness he'd created. And yet she lived. And somehow, despite the betrayal, she didn't speak of hate. She just looked at him, quietly, knowingly. One morning, as snow began to fall outside, Elsie asked for Ember to be saddled. The servants hesitated. "Miss Elsie, you're still weak," the maid protested. But Elsie was firm. "Please, I need to go to the river." With help, she was lifted onto Ember's back, wrapped in thick blankets. The wind was biting, but her eyes held something warmer, a fire that hadn't been there before. Wordlessly, Charles followed behind, his boots crunching the frost. The stable hands and maids watched from the porch, too afraid to speak, too stunned to intervene. Father and daughter returned to the place where everything had changed. The river looked peaceful again, its surface like glass, hiding the darkness beneath. Ember stopped at the same spot, pawing the ground as if remembering. Elsie climbed down with effort, every step a battle, but she didn't stop until she stood at the very edge. Charles stood behind her, silent. "I remember the way the sky looked," she said softly, "like it didn't care what happened below. And I remember how cold your hands were when you held me under." Her voice didn't shake, but I also remember Ember's cry. It was louder than death. Charles lowered his head. "Elsie, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I could ever forgive myself." She turned, her face pale but strong. "You don't have to forgive yourself. That's not your right to decide." Her words struck like arrows, calm but precise. "But I want you to live with what you did. And I want you to make sure no one else ever has to feel the way I did. Ever again." He looked at her, stunned. "How?" "Start with Ember," she said. "He saved my life. You always thought animals were just tools. You were wrong. He has more soul than most men I've ever met. Honor him. Protect others like him. And as for me, let me live. Really live. Not locked in rooms or hidden from the world." That moment shattered Charles more than any punishment could have. It was mercy from the one person he had wronged beyond redemption. Not because he deserved it, but because she chose it, for herself, not for him. And from that moment forward, Charles Whitmore was no longer the same man. He made changes, big ones. He donated large portions of his land to build a sanctuary for injured and abused animals, naming the grounds Ember's Refuge. He funded programs for disabled children, giving them opportunities he had once denied his own daughter. He invited local reporters to document the story, not to clear his name, but to spread the message. Wealth doesn't buy humanity, but humility can rebuild it. Elsie, now surrounded by love and purpose, began to thrive. She spoke at schools, helped care for horses, and wrote journals about what it meant to be seen as less, but to rise anyway. People came from towns away to meet the girl who survived a river, and the horse that defied death to save her. As for Ember, he lived like a king. His stable was the grandest on the estate, his fields the greenest. But he never strayed far from Elsie. Even in old age, when his steps slowed and his back curved with time, he would still nuzzle her shoulder as if to say, "I remember too." And Charles, he became a quiet figure in the background, still wealthy, still known, but no longer proud. He stopped appearing at grand galas and fancy dinners. Instead, he could often be found by the riverside, staring into the water that once nearly held his darkest secret. Some say they saw him cry there. Others say they heard him whisper apologies to the wind. But what mattered most was that he never looked away from what he had done. He lived with it. He carried it. And he spent the rest of his life trying to turn his worst act into something better. Not perfect, not redeemed, but real. Because sometimes the loudest truths come not from the mouths of men, but from the hooves of a horse who refused to let evil win. Years passed, but the river never forgot. Its quiet current still whispered the memory of that day, a moment where darkness nearly claimed innocence, and love, in its purest form, fought back through the heart of a horse. Ember's name became legend, not just on the estate, but across counties. His story was printed in newspapers, shared in classrooms, even written into children's books. People came from miles away to visit him, not just to see a heroic animal, but to feel what he stood for: loyalty, bravery, and the bond that no cruelty could break. Elsie never once spoke again of that morning at the river, not in anger, not in sorrow. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than words. She grew into a young woman, filled with wisdom beyond her years. Though her body still bore the signs of her struggle, her limp, her small frame, her spirit towered above all who met her. When asked how she found peace, she would smile and say, "Because he didn't win. My father didn't get to erase me. I lived. I healed. And that is my victory." On Ember's final day, the sun cast golden light across the field where he lay. Elsie sat beside him, her hand on his neck, her face pressed against his mane. "Thank you," she whispered, "for choosing me, for saving me, for loving me when no one else did." He let out a soft breath, his eyes never leaving hers, And then, like a king laying down his crown, he slipped away peacefully in the arms of the one soul he had guarded with his life. The whole estate mourned. The flag at Ember's refuge flew at half-mast. They buried him beneath the tallest oak tree by the river, the same tree that had witnessed his defiance. A statue was placed above, not of a war hero, not of a man, but of a horse, eyes fierce, heart unshaken. As for Charles Whitmore, he aged in silence. He watched from a distance as Elsie turned the estate into a place of healing, for animals, for children, for the broken. He never reclaimed his power, never sought praise. In his final years, he visited Ember's grave often, sometimes standing for hours without speaking. On the day he died, a folded letter was found in his coat. It read, "I failed as a father, but I saw what love looks like, because of a child I tried to bury and a horse I couldn't break." The world didn't forget that story, because it wasn't just about cruelty or pain. It was about the strength of a child the world tried to throw away, and the silent power of an animal who refused to let her disappear. That's what truly broke everyone's heart. Not just what happened, but how love rose from it. And in that quiet place by the river, where evil was once born, now stood something far greater. A legacy carved not from wealth or blood, but from courage, mercy, and the soul of a horse that would not let go.